They say the Cold War was fought in shadows, backrooms, and the race to space. But what if I told you that in 1958, the United States Air Force had a plan so audacious, so utterly insane, that it makes every conspiracy theory you've ever heard look tame by comparison? Picture this. A nuclear warhead strapped to a missile, hurtling through the void of space, destination Moon. And when it hits, a flash so bright, so spectacular, that every human being on Earth could look up and witness American might exploding across the lunar surface like the world's deadliest firework display. This wasn't science fiction. This wasn't the plot of a Cold War thriller. This was Project A119, a top-secret military operation that came terrifyingly close to turning the Moon into ground zero for nuclear annihilation. And here's the part that should send chills down your spine. The man calculating exactly how visible that mushroom cloud would be was a 23-year-old doctoral student named Carl Sagan, the same Carl Sagan who would later become one of history's most passionate advocates against nuclear weapons. The irony cuts deeper than any crater that bomb might have left. For more than 4 decades, Project A119 remained buried in classified files, its very existence denied by the government. But the truth has a way of detonating long after the fuse has been lit. And when this particular secret finally exploded into public consciousness, it revealed a moment in history when rational minds seriously considered permanently scarring the face of the Moon simply to prove a point. So what drove America to contemplate such cosmic vandalism? Who greenlit this lunacy? And why did they ultimately decide that maybe, just maybe, nuking the Moon wasn't humanity's finest idea? The story begins not with rockets or warheads, but with a dog. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union shattered American confidence by launching Sputnik 1 into orbit, the first artificial satellite to circle our planet. The satellite itself was barely bigger than a beach ball, weighing just 184 pounds and emitting nothing more threatening than a series of electronic beeps. But those beeps might as well have been sirens wailing across Washington, D.C. Because in the zero-sum game of Cold War supremacy, the Soviets hadn't just launched a satellite. They had publicly, undeniably, humiliatingly proven they could put payloads into space before America could. 1 month later, the embarrassment deepened. Sputnik 2 carried Laika, a stray dog from Moscow's streets, into orbit. The poor creature never came home, but her journey sent an unmistakable message. If the Soviets could launch a living being beyond Earth's atmosphere, they could launch anything. Missiles, warheads, nuclear weapons aimed at American cities with no warning and no defense. American attempts to respond were catastrophic. Project Vanguard, the Navy's satellite program, ended in spectacular failure. The rocket rose just 4 feet off the launch pad before collapsing in a fiery explosion that newsreels captured in humiliating detail. The press had a field day. Foreign newspapers mockingly referred to America's satellite as Kaputnik and Flopnik. The message was clear. The United States was losing, badly, and the entire world was watching. This is the crucible in which Project A119 was forged. Panic, humiliation, and desperation mixed with Cold War paranoia to create an atmosphere where even the most extreme proposals started sounding reasonable. Because what good is having the world's most powerful nuclear arsenal if you can't demonstrate that power in a way that leaves absolutely no room for doubt? Enter the Armor Research Foundation, an institution that had been studying nuclear explosions in various environments since 1949. By 1958, they'd accumulated nearly a decade of data on how atomic weapons behaved everywhere from underground test sites to high-altitude detonations. The logical next question, at least to Cold War military minds, was obvious. What would happen if we detonated a nuclear device on the Moon? The Air Force Special Weapons Center at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico commissioned a study with the innocuous title A Study of Lunar Research Flights, a name so bland it could have described a paper airplane contest. But the actual objective was anything but innocent. They wanted to know if a nuclear explosion on the moon would be visible from Earth. Not just visible, but spectacular, unmistakable, a cosmic middle finger to the Soviet Union that would restore American prestige and remind the world who really held the cards in this deadly poker game. To lead this surreal endeavor, they selected Leonard Riefel, a physicist who had worked alongside Enrico Fermi and would later become deputy director of NASA's Apollo program. Riefel assembled a 10-person team that included Gerard Kuiper, a Dutch-born astronomer who had discovered moons around Uranus and Neptune and would later identify the landing sites for Apollo 11. Kuiper brought with him a brilliant young doctoral student who would handle some of the project's most critical calculations. His name was Carl Sagan. At just 23 years old, Sagan was assigned a task that sounds almost absurd in its specificity. Calculate the spread of lunar dust following a nuclear detonation. Determine whether that dust cloud would obscure the flash of the explosion or enhance it. Figure out exactly how much material would be kicked into the moon's thin exosphere and how sunlight would interact with it. Because if America was going to nuke the moon, the whole point was making sure every person on Earth could see it happen. The team worked through 1958 and into 1959, treating this insane proposition as seriously as any other scientific endeavor. They determined that a hydrogen bomb, initially proposed, was out of the question. Too heavy. The rocket technology simply didn't exist to propel something that massive all the way to the moon. Instead, they settled on a W-25 warhead, a relatively compact device with a yield of 1.7 kilotons, roughly 1/10 the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion itself wouldn't destroy the moon or even significantly damage it. The crater would be microscopic by lunar standards, essentially invisible even through powerful telescopes. But the visual impact, that was the whole game. The plan called for detonation at the lunar terminator, the boundary between the moon's light and dark sides, during a full moon when sunlight would illuminate the resulting dust cloud. Done correctly, the mushroom cloud would glow against the darkness of space, visible to the naked eye from Earth as a brilliant temporary new feature on the lunar surface. The timing was tight but achievable. By 1959, the United States would have intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of hitting lunar targets within 2 miles of their intended impact point. The technology existed, the payload was ready, all that remained was pulling the trigger. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. As Rifle's team compiled their findings, certain uncomfortable realities began crystallizing. Yes, the explosion would be visible. Yes, it would demonstrate American technological prowess. But it would also permanently contaminate a pristine scientific environment with radioactive fallout, potentially ruining decades of future lunar research before it even began. Rifle himself became one of the project's most vocal internal critics. In his reports, he stressed that biological contamination of the moon would represent an unparalleled scientific disaster, eliminating several potentially fruitful approaches to studying the lunar environment. What if humanity wanted to establish a lunar base someday? What if we needed to study the moon's geology without radioactive interference? What if this one moment of Cold War grandstanding destroyed opportunities we couldn't even imagine yet? Then there was the public relations nightmare waiting to happen. Military analysts began questioning how American citizens would actually react to seeing their government blow up the moon. Would it boost morale as intended? Or would it spark widespread backlash, positioning the United States as an aggressor willing to weaponize space itself? And if something went wrong, if the missile failed to reach the moon and fell back to Earth carrying a live nuclear warhead, the consequences would be catastrophic beyond calculation. Are you starting to see the pattern here? The deeper the Pentagon looked at this plan, the more problems emerged. And those problems weren't just technical. They were existential, ethical, and potentially civilization-ending. What do you think the right call was? Would you have pushed forward with a display of power that might have intimidated the Soviets? Or would you have backed away from permanently scarring the moon? Drop your thoughts below. And if you're captivated by these forgotten moments when history balanced on the edge of absolute madness, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, we're just getting started. By 1959, the writing was on the wall. Air Force officials quietly determined that the risks of Project A119 outweighed any potential benefits. The project was cancelled, never progressing beyond theoretical studies. The documents were classified, buried in filing cabinets, and forgotten by everyone except the small team who had worked on them, or so the military hoped. What the Pentagon couldn't have anticipated was the weakness built into their perfect security. Not a spy, not a leak in the traditional sense, but simple human ambition mixed with youthful carelessness. In 1959, Carl Sagan was applying for a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship at Berkeley's Miller Institute. Like any ambitious young scientist, he wanted to make his application as impressive as possible, so he listed his research experience, including papers he'd contributed to while working at the Armour Research Foundation. The titles he included were innocuous enough if you didn't know what they meant. Possible contribution of lunar nuclear weapons detonations to the solution of some problems in planetary astronomy and radiological contamination of the moon by nuclear weapons detonations. To anyone familiar with Project A119, these titles were instant red flags. Sagan had just revealed the existence of a top-secret military program in an academic scholarship application. But here's the truly remarkable part. Nobody noticed. Not in 1959, not in 1960, not for nearly 40 years. Sagan went on to become one of the most famous scientists in the world, writing Cosmos, advocating passionately against nuclear proliferation, and never once publicly mentioning his youthful involvement in a plan to nuke the moon. Whether he felt guilty, embarrassed, or simply moved on to more important work, we'll never know. But the secret held. Until 1999. That's when writer Key Davidson was researching a biography of Carl Sagan, who had died 3 years earlier. Deep in the archives of Sagan's academic papers, Davidson found that 1959 fellowship application. The titles jumped out immediately. A few discreet inquiries confirmed what seemed impossible. The United States Air Force had seriously planned to detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon, and one of the greatest science communicators in history had helped make the calculations. Davidson kept quiet initially, but when his biography, Carl Sagan, A Life, was published, a review in Nature, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, highlighted the bombshell discovery. The revelation created immediate controversy. Had Sagan violated national security? Should he have been prosecuted? And more pressingly, was this insane story actually true? That's when Leonard Rifle, now in his 80s and still living, broke his decades-long silence. In a letter to Nature and subsequent interviews with The Guardian, Rifle confirmed everything. Project A119 was real. The plan to nuke the moon was seriously developed. And yes, Carl Sagan's inclusion of those paper titles in his fellowship application had technically constituted a breach of confidentiality, though one that went undetected for 4 decades. The United States government never officially acknowledged any of it. To this day, no formal admission exists. But Rifle's revelations triggered a Freedom of Information Act request, and in 2000, the surviving documentation was declassified and released. A Study of Lunar Research Flights, Volume 1, became publicly available for the first time, offering a glimpse into one of the strangest chapters of Cold War planning. Here's what makes the story even more surreal. 8 reports were originally created for Project A119. By the time historians went looking, 7 of them had been destroyed. The Illinois Institute of Technology, which had housed the Armour Research Foundation, systematically eliminated most of the documentation in the 1980s. Whether this was routine destruction of old classified materials or deliberate erasure of an embarrassing chapter remains unclear. What survived was just enough to confirm the broad outlines while leaving countless details lost forever. And the Soviets? They had their own version. Project E4, developed around the same time, followed a remarkably similar trajectory. Soviet planners wanted to detonate a nuclear device on the Moon to commemorate the anniversary of the October Revolution. They even considered targeting the explosion to coincide with a lunar eclipse, maximizing visibility from Earth. But just like the Americans, the Soviets ultimately concluded that the risks far outweighed any propaganda value. Both superpowers independently arrived at the same conclusion. Nuking the Moon was a terrible idea. Boris Chertok, a legendary Soviet rocket engineer, confirmed the existence of Project E4 in 1999, around the same time Project A119 became public knowledge. The symmetry is almost poetic. Both nations considered the same insane gesture. Both assembled teams of brilliant scientists to study its feasibility. Both quietly cancelled their plans. And both kept the whole thing secret for 40 years, only for the truth to emerge simultaneously as the Cold War faded into history. What came next was, thankfully, far more constructive. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963 prohibited nuclear weapons testing in space. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 went further, banning the placement of nuclear weapons on celestial bodies and declaring space, including the Moon, the common heritage of mankind. These agreements didn't just prevent future Project A119s. They represented a collective recognition that some lines shouldn't be crossed, even in the depths of geopolitical rivalry. But let's not pretend this story ends with everyone learning their lesson and moving toward enlightenment. As late as 2015, Elon Musk casually suggested nuking Mars to terraform it. His proposal sparked immediate backlash, but it also revealed something troubling. The impulse to solve problems with nuclear explosions never fully went away. It just got repackaged for a new generation. So where does that leave us? Project A119 never happened. No nuclear weapon ever touched the lunar surface. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on a moon unscarred by American or Soviet ambition. That pristine environment rifle fought to protect remained intact, allowing decades of scientific study that revolutionized our understanding of planetary formation, Earth's history, and the early solar system. But the fact that this plan existed at all tells us something profound about the Cold War era. It wasn't just a period of tension between superpowers. It was a time when fear, pride, and the desperate need to demonstrate superiority drove decision-makers to contemplate acts that border on madness. Carl Sagan's involvement adds a layer of complexity that's impossible to ignore. Here was a man who would spend the rest of his career advocating for nuclear disarmament, warning about the dangers of nuclear winter, and preaching the fragility of our pale blue dot suspended in a sunbeam. Yet in his youth, he crunched the numbers that might have enabled one of the most reckless acts in human history. Did that experience shape his later views? Did calculating how to make a nuclear mushroom cloud visible from Earth plant the seeds of his passionate opposition to nuclear weapons? We'll never know, but the irony is inescapable. Here's the final thought that refuses to let go. Project A119 came within a hair's breadth of execution. The technology existed. The warhead was ready. The calculations were complete. All that stood between concept and detonation was a final authorization that never came. Historians tend to focus on the things that happened, the decisions that shaped our world, the actions that changed history. But sometimes the most important moments are the ones that almost happened, the bullets we dodged without even realizing we were in danger. What if cooler heads hadn't prevailed? What if the desire to one-up the Soviets had been just slightly stronger than the fear of public backlash? The moon we look at today might bear a permanent scar, a reminder of human arrogance frozen in vacuum for eternity. Future generations would have pointed to that crater and asked what kind of people would do such a thing, and we wouldn't have had a good answer. That's the legacy of Project A119. Not what happened, but what almost did. A reminder that in moments of crisis, panic, and perceived weakness, even rational societies can contemplate irrational acts. The fact that this particular act never occurred doesn't erase the disturbing reality that it came close. Very close. So when you look up at the moon tonight, take a moment to appreciate something rarely acknowledged. Its face remains unchanged, unmarked by nuclear ambition, because somewhere in 1959, enough people decided that winning a propaganda war wasn't worth permanently damaging humanity's closest celestial neighbor. In the grand scheme of Cold War lunacy, that might be the closest thing to wisdom we got. Think about that the next time someone tells you government decisions are always rational. Because once upon a time, in a smoky Pentagon planning room, serious men in suits seriously discussed turning the moon into the world's most visible nuclear test site. And the only thing that stopped them was the creeping realization that maybe, just maybe, that was a bridge too far even for the Cold War.